want to play a little bit with alternate history. It's not something I usually do, but in the circumstances, it would be interesting. Um, President Alexei Navalny of Russia. Think of that for a second. Think of what the implications would be with relations with the West. I think there is no question that Navalny died at Putin's hands. Whether it was deliberate murder or death from neglect, this comes down to the regime's actions against him. And his spokeswoman has used the word murder, as have many Putin critics. Um, but quite frankly, whether there was a rogue element that done something to him in prison, notably they're refusing to release his body to his family, and you cannot trust a state autopsy in these circumstances. But whether it was something like that or whether he died from neglect, it's hard to tell. He appeared a few days ago and seemed visibly healthy. Um, the the claim is that he has RT has claimed he died from thrombosis. Well, that's RT. You got to take a word they say as reliable when it comes to Putin's critics. Um, in 2013, Navalny ran for mayor of Moscow, and he got 27% of the vote. But that's significant, although he lost. 27% is a hefty chunk considering he had almost no media exposure. I've just watched an interesting interview from 2017 with Stephen Sakur on Hard Talk, the BBC's Hard Talk. And Sakur was, putting quite a slate, quite what's the expression, putting quite a damper on Navalny's optimism about reform in Russia by saying, Mr. Navalny, you just have no chance of winning. With all due respect, you have no chance of winning. Um, and the thing about Navalny was, despite the personal hardship that he went through, he always seemed to have a sense of humor and an optimism. And I wonder, was that a sort of defense mechanism just to keep himself sane, really? Because, being sent to that Arctic prison, no matter how physically tough someone is, and I think Navalny was physically a strong man. He was quite a big guy. He was to survive the poisoning as he did and still continue fighting on. It wasn't just mental courage. I think he was physically tough. Um, but despite all of that, there must have been times that deep in his psyche he thought this is very, very difficult. So I think he used that as a way to keep saying. That's just my speculation. Um, One of the questions Sakura asked was about Crimea. And let's consider an alternate reality here, where some miracle happened and the Putin regime collapsed, or it wasn't rigged up in favor of Putin, and the apparatus of the state was such that there was an opportunity for Navalny to actually make a breakthrough. Of course, all his supporters are being arrested now for going to vigils. Navalny made the point, incidentally, that Putin's very high approval ratings doesn't really mean anything. You could see the same thing in the former Soviet states of Central Asia and Zimbabwe. And in the Soviet Union, he pointed out that it was often 100%. So it doesn't really mean anything when the state media controls, the narrative. That's why I think someone like Margarita Simonian of RT is contemptible, because she may not be a soldier in this war that Putin has, this irredentist war, but she is every bit as guilty, I think. I don't see her as just a journalist. I think she's a neo-nationalist propagandist, and I hope she was high on the list of sanctions when they were brought in. But in an alternate reality, it's worth looking a bit at Navalny's background. Now, it has to be said he wasn't perfect. Over a decade ago, he was quite a nationalist, and at his rallies there were, frankly, neo Nazis. He did speak in harsh terms about migrants to Russia, and that's not entirely honourable when you consider the very real racism that has happened in Russia. against ethnic minorities. Far right violence is often been treated with relative leniency. Um, but Navalny made the point that he done that he had to get an umbrella of people to look inwards to get away from Putin's irredentism. But over time, he did become more liberal and progressive. I think the fact that he had flaws just makes him all the more human. Every admirable figure has. Um, and I've just got a quote from the British American financier, this is in the Times, Bill Browder. He said that Navalny wanted to be the Nelson Mandela of Russia, and he ended up being the Martin Luther King. And that speaks for itself. Browder himself is, targeted by the Putin regime. Incidentally, in the last few days, the Putin regime has been making failed threats against the Estonian Prime Minister. It's pretty damn obvious that, this is a regime that just will try and crush anyone that gets in its way. Um, and that speaks for itself. But getting back to this alternate reality, if we look at Navalny's track record, the annexation of Crimea, he did not condemn that at the time. In fact, he kind of pitched to the Kremlin's line that it was part of Russian territory. But again, he changed his position on that. And in this interview with Stephen Sakur, he acknowledged it was illegal, an illegal annexation, but he also said that it's complex, like a lot of conflicts. I honestly think had Navalny, in some alternate reality, had he become president of Russia, um, we could say that relations with the West would not be perfect. I'm sure there would have been differences, probably over Ukraine, but I definitely think Navalny would have either found some compromise or not started the war in the first place. A President Navalny. There would have been disagreements with the West. The West had disagreements with Gorbachev. The West had disagreements with Yeltsin. There would have been disagreements, but I can absolutely say with certainty relations would be much, much better. Often Russia apologists will say, oh, well, the West has provoked Russia and, it's the encirclement of NATO. Well, you just need to look at a map to see that isn't true. The vast majority of Russia's land territory and indeed sea territory is not NATO countries. So this narrative of Russia's felt threatened by NATO. What's actually happened is Russia has pushed countries into NATO with its aggressive actions in neighbouring states like Georgia and, of course, Ukraine. So it's actually pushed countries towards NATO. This is what the Finnish president said. Why is it that a neutral country like Finland, it's a Western country, but neutral in the sense that it wasn't in NATO, then suddenly goes for NATO membership? It's because of the reality that they need protection. That being in NATO offers a degree of protection that not being in NATO doesn't. Um, Obviously, this is alternate history that I'm talking about. We'll never really know, but I think because of Navalny's track record against corruption, his support for democratic institutions like the freedom of the press, his advocacy for those sort of things. By the way, I'm going to put a link under the video to don't call him Dimon. That was his very viral expose of Dmitry Medvedev. He's done others on Putin, but that one got 46 million views on YouTube. It's in Russian language, but there's an English version as well. I'll put it under my video link. And the editing with that, I have to give Navalny's team credit as well. It's slick, it's very well done, despite getting no media coverage from Russian state media. It shows the intelligence of Alexei Navalny, not just the courage of this man, but the intelligence, the subtlety, not subtlety, the assertiveness that he could do all of this despite the threats against him. It just makes him all the more admirable as far as I'm concerned. Um, but I do think a President Navalny would have at least tried to get much better relations with the West, and the West would have reciprocated. It wouldn't have been perfect. There would have been disagreements, but I am convinced that the difficult relations that the West has with Russia comes down to the Putin regime and its irredentist obsessions, its paranoia, its Western phobia. They often complain about Russophobia. Well, what about Western phobia? Um, if you look at RT, it's ultra national, it's vociferously anti West, always has been. They don't even attempt to portray the West in any sort of positive light. So yeah, that's the reality. There are, of course, I think the mistake would be now sort of thinking this is a tragedy, it's awful, it shows how terrible Putin's regime is, and focus on Navalny. And it's right that he gets, the eulogies pour in, but there are still a lot of dissidents in Russian prisons. There's the journalist Evan Gershkovich, and the Russian journalist Vladimir Karam, uh, getting the man's name right. Vladimir Kara-Mirza, I think his name is. I think I've said that wrong, but um, there are other dissidents, and I don't know if anyone will be able to fill Navalny's shoes in terms of prominence, but these people are also very brave and they need support. And I think the focus now should be on Navalny's supporters, his family, and other Russian dissidents to give them as much support as is humanly possible. I think the West should absolutely speak out in favor of those people. Um, yeah, but ultimately, it shows Putin's cowardice. Navalny called him a little jackal. I mean, Putin's physically quite small, but I think it's more about the point that at core, all dictators are cowards. They're scared of criticism. Putin may be smiling now because his main opposition uh, figure has been silenced, but I think it's every dictatorship comes to an end, and sooner or later, whether it be by a coup, like there may be a more successful coup than the one launched by Prigozhin last year, or whether it be by natural death. I remember when the old Soviet leaders, their health was really bad and they always put on a facade. But that's not to say that Putin is dying. There's been speculation on Putin's health for a long time. He's 70. If he's in good health, unfortunately, he could go for a long time yet. But he changed the constitution to, in theory, stay in power until 2036, which would make him as long serving, as long reigning, as long presiding as Stalin. In fact, even more than Stalin. I think Stalin was 27 years. Well, Putin